Samuel Houston was born in Rockbridge County, Virginia on March 2nd of 1793. His father's name was also Samuel Houston, making Sam a junior. His mother was Elizabeth Paxton. Together, this couple would have 9 children. Money was always a tight issue when considering that you had to feed these 9 children, so the Houston family planned to sell their land and join the frontiersmen in Tennessee to try to scrape out a better living there. In 1806, these plans would need to be put on the back burner when Sam Houston Sr. unfortunately passed away. This only paused the Houston family, though, who continued the process of selling their land in Virginia for new, cheaper land in Tennessee. With help from her children, Elizabeth Houston then set up a small farm near Maryville, Tennessee, a small town where the Houston family kids would run a little store. In his early life, Sam Houston could be described as something of an outcast. As a teenager, he would explore the edges of the frontiers, alone, perhaps encountering the local Cherokee tribes that lived just on the peripheries of America. Sam did not even believe in his family's Presbyterian Christianity, and like all good outcasts, Sam rejected most of his schooling in an effort to self-educate himself. He read books from his father's library, like Jedediah Morse, the father of Samuel Morse, the later inventor of the telegraph. Jedediah Morse, on the other hand, was a famous American geographer, which makes complete sense when considering how much Sam loved to explore the frontiers of America. When Sam was only 16, he decided to join another group who were viewed as an outcast by other Americans. So he ran away from home in 1809 and went to Hiawatha Island, which was located at the conflux of the Tennessee and Hiawatha rivers. On this island, a Cherokee tribe of Native Americans accepted the 16-year-old boy as one of their own. The chief of this tribe was named Chief Jolly, and eventually Sam would learn the Cherokee language and be fully integrated into the tribe with his own Cherokee name, Raven. Sam would live the life of a Cherokee Indian for 3 years, until 1812, when he returned to Maryville, Tennessee as a much more rugged and experienced 19-year-old man. Then, Sam must have had a change of heart about education and religion, as he attended the Western Theological Seminary, where he was taught by its founder, Isaac Anderson. The adventurous spirit of Sam Houston could only be quelled for a short time. He had found another opportunity in 1812, specifically in the War of 1812. This war pitted the new United States of America against its old colonial owner, the British. In 1813, he joined the 39th Infantry Regiment, where he impressed the Lieutenant Colonel, Thomas Benton, who quickly promoted the 20-year-old Sam Houston to 3rd Lieutenant. By 1814, this regiment was assigned under the command of General Andrew Jackson, a man who can be described as an opposite to Houston in the department of feelings towards Native Americans. This can be seen as the only reason why he joined Andrew Jackson's regiment was due to a new war that had started with a group of Native Americans known as the Red Stick Creeks. Lieutenant Houston would find himself in a favorable spot, though, as his Cherokee brethren would help Andrew Jackson in this war. The multilingual Houston probably spent ample time in this war conversing with Cherokee Indians. After all, he was one of them. In 1814, after a few months of being in Jackson's army, Houston would find himself in the thick of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. By the end of the battle, 800 of the 1,000 Cherokee warriors lay dead. Only 47 Americans would find themselves in that same position, and 159 Americans would be wounded, with Sam Houston being among them. He was wounded badly, and many doctors saw little hope for the 20-year-old lieutenant. Miraculously, though, he survived, and returned to Maryville to heal from his wounds. While he was healing, Houston would earn the rank of 2nd lieutenant for the bravery that he had shown. In 1817, a few years after the end of the War of 1812, General Jackson would give Houston a job that would test the allegiances and beliefs of him. Jackson assigned him to remove the Cherokee from eastern Tennessee. This made sense as Houston tried to relieve the worries of his fellow Cherokee. Houston would dress in traditional native clothing when talking to the Cherokees. Raven, as he was called by the natives, showed up to the wrong meeting. He was still dressed in his native attire when meeting with the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. This big bird-looking, pro-slavery believing piece of plantation-owning garbage is one of the worst American politicians of all time, which is why it makes me very happy that Sam Houston hated him. After showing up to the meeting, John Calhoun reprimanded him for being too pro-Cherokee. He probably was, after all, and the next thing that he did would prove that even more. Sam joined the Cherokee in 1818 after he resigned from the army to help them by resettling in Arkansas. Arkansas happened to share a border with the neighboring province of Texas that was currently revolting. The Mexican War of Independence for Spain was in full swing, and they would fully gain that independence by 1821. After helping the resettling Cherokee, Sam would return to Tennessee, this time going to the up-and-coming city of Nashville. In Nashville, Sam blazed through law school, finishing it in under a year, and opened his own law practice in 1819 near Lebanon, Tennessee. The charismatic and loved Houston was then, in a flurry, appointed to the District Attorney of Nashville and Major General of the Tennessee Militia. Tennessee was also home to another influential American, Andrew Jackson, These two wartime buddies would also join the same political party, the early Democratic Party that was newly founded by Martin Van Buren. With backing from Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston ran nearly unopposed as a member of the Tennessee House of Representatives. Of course, he would win this in 1823 and joined his fellow representatives in Washington, D.C. Uniquely, his first speech addressing the House would be to support the nation of Greece, who was currently revolting and fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Sam would eventually repay the backing that Jackson had gave him and advocate for Andrew Jackson in his 1824 presidential campaign that he would lose to John Quincy Adams. The mutual respect that Houston and Jackson shared for one another would once again be shown in 1827. Jackson would then support Samuel Houston in the election for the governor of Tennessee. As governor, Houston would support the infrastructure of Tennessee by connecting the many rivers of Tennessee with the construction of canals. As governor, he returned the favor once again to General Jackson in the 1828 presidential election. This election would see the first Democratic president win, with Andrew Jackson winning the majority of votes. A year later in 1829, the 36-year-old Houston decided to settle down and marry Eliza Ann in January of 1829. This would only last 3 months, as it was rumored that Eliza Allen was in love with a different man. This devastated Houston, who couldn't take the new, complicated, and divorced hole that he found himself in. Houston longed for an escape, away from the deceitful politicians of Tennessee and away from his divorce. So, Sam resigned as governor, donned his old Native American clothes, and took back his other name, Raven. Raven then set off to join with the Cherokee, who he had helped to resettle in Arkansas. 1829 was a bad year to do this, though. Houston's old wartime and political friend Andrew Jackson would start to show his true colors. His anti-Indian stance would culminate again, when he ordered for the removal of the Cherokees once again. But he didn't just order for the Cherokees to remove themselves from American land. No, he ordered for the removal of thousands of Indians from as far away as Michigan to the Seminoles of Florida. The 1830 Indian Removal Act would see these natives all joined together in mostly what is the modern-day state of Oklahoma. Sam Houston tried to alleviate the stress of his Cherokee brethren by going to Washington, D.C. to try to gift the Cherokees with food rations on their westward journey. This would fail, and thousands of Cherokees would die on the Trail of Tears due to hypothermia and starvation. Houston would find himself in D.C. again in 1832. This time, a congressman named William Stanberry accused Houston of illegal collusion with the Jackson administration. Houston would write to Stanberry multiple times, and every time he would get no response. Having been fed up with politicians and Andrew Jackson's anti-Indian policies, Sam Houston snapped. Houston would end up beating Stanberry with a cane for his trash-talking nature. Sam was left satisfied by this, but the U.S. government was not amused. They brought him to a trial in the House of Representatives. Here, Houston would once again be reprimanded by the U.S. government. By a surprisingly close vote of 106 to 89, Houston lost and was forced to pay $500. What Houston wanted now was a new path in life. So he joined the hundreds of Americans who had began settling in the Mexican province of Texas. The Mexican government, for a while now, had started to invite Americans like Stephen Austin to settle in their sparsely populated territory. In December of 1832, Houston found himself in this Mexican territory. Sam was appointed to represent Nacogdoches at the Texan 1833 convention that tried to convince Mexico to make Texas one of their states. Mexico would refuse, and by 1834, President Santa Anna captured and arrested the Texan leader, Stephen Austin. It didn't take long after this for the American settlers in Texas to revolt against their Mexican government. Just a year later in 1835, Sam Houston became Major General Sam Houston, the highest-ranking officer in the hastily assembled Texan army. In 1836, Texas officially became their own country. Modeled after America, they became the Republic of Texas. Soon after this, the Alamo would come under siege, and Major General Houston tried to send soldiers to the little makeshift fort, but they were too late. Is there even a successful Texan revolution without the martyrdom of the Alamo, though? After all, the trademark saying of the Texan revolutionaries is, "Remember the Alamo." Later, in the year of 1836, Santa Anna caught up with Houston's force of 783 men and trapped them in the confines of a marshy swamp. This might have been the plan after all, as the Mexican soldiers, reassured by their soon-to-be victory, stayed and camped on the outskirts of the swamp. This mistake would give Houston an opportunity to sneak attack the Mexican camp and eventually capture Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Texans only agreed to release Santa Anna after he agreed to make peace with the newly formed Republic of Texas. Houston would receive another battle wound. This time his ankle was shattered, and he would be forced back to America for medical treatment. Upon returning to Texas later in 1836, Houston would run to be the first president of Texas. Samuel Houston would win this election and take office on October 22nd of 1836. Becoming the first president meant that Sam had a lot of work cut out for him. Houston was forced to deal with the debt that Texas had incurred during their revolution. Sam Houston also wanted to join the United States, but he was refused by his friend Andrew Jackson. Jackson did not want to unbalance the slave and non-slave states, so he did not agree to the Texan annexation. But he did try to help his old friend. At the end of Jackson's second term, his last decision as president was to recognize the Republic of Texas as a true country, which was definitely a step forward. Houston wanted to regain good relations with Mexico, and was unsurprisingly pro-Indian. Well, that is until his buttons were pushed. In 1838, the Cordova Rebellion would start. When Sam Houston heard of this in his new capital city of Houston, that was named after himself, he sent the Texas Rangers to deal with it. Sam had created this self-supplying military force so that he could cut back on military spending to try to pay off the Texan debt. The Rangers would put down the Cordova Rebellion, which was a Mexican-fueled attempt to win back Texas with help from local Kickapoo Indians. For Cherokee natives, he tried to gain alliances and give them favorable treaties, which was widely unpopular in Texas. Sam Houston was even progressive enough to support the end of Texan slavery, but this too was unpopular in Texas. In 1838, Houston would leave office, and in his place, Maribel B. Lamar would be selected as the second president of Texas. Maribel Bonaparte Lamar was born on August 16, 1798, in the southern state of Georgia. His parents' names were John and Rebecca Lamar. John Lamar owned a cotton plantation where the young Maribel would grow up alongside his older brother, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar. Okay, I know what you're thinking. What weird historian named these two poor kids who were now bound to be bullied for their eccentric names? Well, this weird historian happened to be his uncle, who was a fan of the Roman Cincinnatus and Napoleon Bonaparte. At the time of Maribel's birth, Napoleon Bonaparte was not the Emperor of France trying to conquer the world. No, only a month before Maribel's birth, Napoleon landed in Egypt as a French general. Napoleon was considered a French hero at this time, and probably someone that Maribel looked up to. Like Sam Houston, Maribel Lamar was self-educated, reading any book that he happened to find in his father's library. He cherished this self-education so much that he refused to further his education by going to college or university. The man was even accepted into Princeton University, and declined them. He chose to undertake a few career paths in the newspaper and sales industries, which would prove to be largely unsuccessful. But don't worry, because Mommy and Daddy would bail him out of the financial hole that he found himself in. His wealthy, slave-owning parents had connections all throughout Georgia and the whole of the South. Lamar's family could be considered to be part of the Southern aristocratic families who flaunted their wealth that they had gained on the back of slave labor. So in 1823, his parents convinced the new governor of Georgia, George M. Troup, to make the 25-year-old Maribel Lamar his private secretary. Lamar did have a little bit of experience for this role, with his brief stint as a newspaper writer, as he would have the responsibility of speaking to journalists on behalf of Governor Troup. Maribel would find himself traveling all over the state of Georgia, speaking of the latest news from the governor. Along the way, he met his first and only wife, Tabitha Jordan, who he would eventually marry in 1826. Although Lamar never attended college, he did excel in a few notable skills, among them being swordsmanship, horse riding, and the works of poetry. All of these he could be considered an expert at. Unfortunately, Lamar would lose his job of private secretary when Governor Troup lost his re-election campaign of 1828. The now much more experienced and more well-known Lamar then set up a new newspaper editorial called the Columbus Inquirer. Where his previous editorial would fail, this one would succeed and provide Lamar with substantial wealth and a small amount of fame. In 1830, an obituary would appear in the Columbus Inquirer that would feature the death of his wife, Tabitha, who had succumbed to the scarlet fever of tuberculosis. Maribel was devastated by this and vowed that he would never remarry. After recovering from Tabitha's death, Maribel started undergoing the process of becoming a lawyer. In 1833, he was admitted to the Bar Association, all while he was running for his first election. He would win this election and earn himself a seat on the Georgia House of Representatives in 1833. Maribel would commonly spend a lot of time alone on the road in solitude, traveling, reading, and writing his famed poetry. He would take one of these lonely trips in 1834, after the death of his brother. Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar became a judge. Then, he committed suicide by gunshot, after he condemned an innocent man to death. The distraught Maribel needed nothing more than this, to start the longest road trip of his 36-year-old life. Nearly a year of traveling westward would put Lamar in the direct path of Texas. He was still a part of Mexico at this time, although a revolutionary spirit was beginning to form among the American settlers there. While in Texas, he stayed with his friend, James Fannin, who was a slave trader, showing the type of company that Lamar surrounded himself with. After this visit, he returned to Georgia, until he heard that Texas had started their open revolt against Mexico. Lamar heard of the retreating army of Major General Sam Houston and sought after him. He would find Sam Houston, who continued his eastward retreat until he found himself in the swamps of Buffalo Bayou, surrounded by the soldiers of Santa Anna. The day before the Battle of San Jacinto, Private Colonel Lamar was walking the perimeter of the swamp when he came upon two Texan soldiers who were caught out in the open. Without a hesitation, the expert horseman sprung to action, riding hard and fast towards his two comrades. Lamar managed to reach them before the Mexican army could, and they would be so impressed by the speed and bravery of Lamar that they wouldn't fire a single shot at him. Instead, the surprised Mexican soldiers saluted the brave horseman, earning their respect. The gallant Lamar was then promoted by General Houston to command the whole Texan cavalry, which only numbered 62 including Lamar. Nevertheless, cavalry officer Lamar showed more bravery in the next day at the Battle of San Jacinto. These actions would see Lamar become a war hero, but more importantly, it would gain him the recognition of Samuel Houston. After Houston became president of the Republic of Texas, he chose Lamar to be his vice president. The two war heroes effectively ran Texas for the next 2 years. To describe Marabou as the opposite of Houston might just be an understatement. This opposite nature would be shown when Lamar ran for the president of Texas in 1838. A rule in the Texan Constitution stipulated that a president could not run for re-election in consecutive terms, meaning that Sam Houston would need to pick a successor to his presidency. For this, he appointed Peter Grayson. Unfortunately, Houston would need to look again because Grayson would commit suicide due to financial problems. So Houston looked and found a Texan lawyer named James Collingworth to fill the role, until he jumped off a boat and killed himself. Okay, well, third time's a charm, right? Houston's new pick would be a War of 1812 veteran and a local handyman named Robert Wilson. The problem was that, unless you were getting something fixed, nobody really knew Wilson that well, and Marabou Lamar ran pretty much unopposed in the 1838 election. This was shown as Lamar won by a landslide of 252 to 6,995 votes, a 96.5% voting favor. So on December 10th of 1838, Marabou Bonaparte Lamar would become president, but not before Sam Houston got a last word in. Well, it was more like last 10,000 words in, because his farewell address would be a staggering 3 hours long. After Houston got done speaking, Lamar was left speechless. No, seriously, the man couldn't talk, and one of his aides had to give his inaugural address. Houston might not have won the 1838 election, but he had certainly won that day. Marabou's presidency was nothing to be desired. He was pro-slavery, anti-Indian, anti-Mexico, pro-military, and anti-annexation to the US. When I said he was the opposite of Houston, I wasn't kidding. We can save all the bad stuff for later. Let's go over the good things he did first. Despite not going to college, Marabou was a huge supporter of both public and private education. Lamar set aside land in every county of Texas, equating to 18,000 total acres, for the construction of public schools. He also set aside 150 square miles of land for the construction of Texas A&M and the University of Texas. The latter was established in his new capital to escape the yellow fever-ridden capital of Houston, and despite Sam Houston, he moved the capital to the renamed city of Austin, which remains as the capital of Texas today. Before Marabou renamed it to Austin, it had another name, a name of a city where a certain French general would suffer his final defeat. This city's name was Waterloo, and this French general's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Marabou Bonaparte Lamar. This is a slightly suspicious act when considering your middle name. Okay, now it's time to talk about all the bad things Lamar did in his 3 years of presidency. A few weeks into his presidency, he revamped the military that the $1.4 million in debt Texas couldn't afford. Then he used this new army to kick all of the Native Americans out of Texas. He started with the Cherokee under Chief Bowles, who was a personal friend of Sam Houston. The Cherokees agreed to leave, but only after they had harvested their corn that they had planted. The racist Lamar did not allow for this and sent his army to deal with them. Chief Bowles would be shot and killed by the Texans, with the hat gifted to Bowles from Sam Houston being sent to the now furious Houston. Marabou Lamar was trying to appropriate a genocide of natives, as he is quoted as saying that the Indians must be totally extinct. His next target would be a much more trickier and more terrifying opponent. The fearsome Comanche Indians would be invited to negotiate a prisoner exchange with the Texan government. The talks would turn into violence and a massacre of Comanche would ensue. Some escaped, but many Comanche were murdered. The ones that did escape returned to the Comanche, who now formed large warrior bands to raid deeper into Texas than they had ever done. Every raid saw that multi-million-dollar debt of Texas tick up and up. Houston's new army could never decisively defeat the nomadic Comanche. Besides running a genocide, Lamar also expanded the Texan Navy that he, once again, could not afford. Speaking of things that Lamar couldn't afford, in 1839 he took $90,000 from the Texan treasury to support a military expedition to Santa Fe. He wanted Santa Fe, which was a part of Mexico, to join with Texas. He definitely couldn't afford a war with Mexico. The 300 men he sent were unsuccessful, arrested, and transported to a prison in Mexico City. Lamar, unlike Houston, thought that Texas should be an independent nation and not be annexed by America. He supported this idea so much that he started to print out his own money. The problem with the printed money was that it wasn't backed by gold, silver, or anything. It was so ineffective as money that it was only worth 12 cents in America. 1841 would be the final year of Lamar's disastrous presidency. He managed to drive Texas from $1.4 million of debt to a whopping $7 million of debt. In 1841, Lamar would hand the presidency back to Houston, almost as if he was just borrowing it from his far more liberal contemporary. The rest of his life would see fight in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. He then, unsurprisingly, found himself in financial trouble and borrowed money from his cousin. Then in 1857, President James Buchanan chose Lamar to be the ambassador of both Nicaragua and Costa Rica, until his death in 1859. To conclude on Lamar, I'm just going to say this. If he lived until the 1861 American Civil War, he definitely would have been a radical Confederate. We already went over the early life of Sam Houston in this video linked here, so let's go over the next few years. Let's start where we left off with Sam. It's the end of Sam's first term as president of Texas. A rule in the Texas Constitution stipulates that a president cannot run for consecutive terms. So Samuel Houston is forced to stand by while his former vice president takes the presidency in a landslide election. Houston knows that his former VP, Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, will force away almost all of this hard work that he had accomplished in his presidency. So Samuel Houston makes sure to leave him a little something in his farewell address. Sam then goes on a 3-hour-long speech, invigorating the crowd and absolutely stunning the new president. Mirabeau is left so speechless by Sam's speech that he doesn't even get up to talk at his own inaugural address that followed Sam Houston's farewell address. If it wasn't for the rule that was in the Constitution, Houston probably would have ran for his second term and won right away. While Houston retired from the role of president, he remained restless. In 1839, Sam founded a new law practice, this time in Texas. He was also a founding member of the Sabine City Land Development Company, where he and the owners tried to build up Sabine City from a town to a true city. In 1839, only a year after his 2-year stint as president, Houston would run for another Texan government seat. This time, he ran for the House of Representatives for San Augustine County, easily winning this election. Houston spent the rest of his time watching the ticking clock that would eventually see the end of Mirabeau Lamar's disastrous presidency. Houston was not a fan of most of the things that Lamar stood for. Mirabeau Lamar even started what can only be described as a genocide against the Native Americans that Sam Houston had always had a soft spot for. After defeating David G. Burnett by 4,000 votes, Sam was handed back the country that he had helped to found and seen delve into around $7 million of debt under President Lamar. Sam Houston reenacted many of the same policies that he had once had in his first term. This included friendly relations with the Native Americans, cutting government expenses, especially in the military, as well as trying to get the USA to annex Texas. For his Secretary of State, Sam chose a man that was very much like himself in political thinking. His name was Anson Jones, and he will become very important in a few years. Upon becoming president, Houston almost immediately set up a meeting between him and the Native American tribes in Texas. This meeting re-established good relations, and the result would promote free trade and coexistence with the natives, much to the dislike of many Texans. One expense that Houston could easily cut out of the equation of Texan finance was the newly built Navy that Lamar had funded. The newly employed sailors did not want to lose their boats because they wanted to keep their job, so they did something quite comical to avoid the disbanding of their ship. The crew, under Captain Edwin Moore, decided to stay at sea so President Houston could never disband them. Houston wasn't a person that you wanted to avoid, as Edwin Moore and the rest of his crew were all declared as pirates. Not wanting to be a fugitive on the open sea, the crew decided to return to their Texan harbor at Galveston. President Sam arrived to disband the ships, but the people of Galveston rejected this. They saw how much Edwin Moore and his crew wanted their jobs, so they refused Sam Houston when he wanted to sell the boats. Reluctantly, Houston gave in and decided to keep the Navy. Just another expense that the $8 million in-debt Texas just couldn't afford. During Houston's first term, he tried to create good relations between Texas and its mother country of Mexico. Lamar would ruin this with his Santa Fe expedition, and Mexico would notice. President Santa Anna was eager to reinvade Texas and get revenge on the rebels there. So in March of 1842, he ordered for an invasion of southern Texas, taking multiple cities and going as far north as San Antonio. The Mexican army seemed to be trying to reclaim lost land from Texas, but this wouldn't stop Houston from reacting. Fearing that an attack on the Texan capital of Austin was imminent, Sam decided that it was due time to move the archives of Texas. All the history of the fledgling Texas nation was kept in Austin, including the Declaration of Independence as well as the Texan Constitution. Houston sent the Texan Rangers to evacuate these prized papers. No one cared enough to notify the citizens of Austin, though, who promptly shot at what they thought to be traitors. Not wanting to escalate the situation, the Rangers ran away from the Austin citizens, who ended up keeping the archives of Texas. The Mexican army that had invaded southern Texas was still on the loose and needed to be dealt with promptly. 220 Texan Rangers were sent out to deal with this. Being outnumbered by the Mexican army 7 times over was a scary prospect. This prospect was made even scarier when a band of 200 Cherokee warriors joined the now reinforced Mexican army. The Mexicans held a fortified position in a nearby town, and obviously held the advantage. It was time for some Texan trickery to be orchestrated for a decisive victory. John Coffee Hayes was chosen to lure the Mexican army into an ambush where the 200 Texan Rangers waited. John Coffee Hayes was given 37 men for this task, which he succeeded in. The Mexican army is caught off guard, and the rout would begin. The running Mexican army would take 60 casualties as the Rangers would only see the death of 1 man, with only 9 being wounded. The Battle of Salado Creek would be the final and most decisive Texan victory of this newly ignited Texican-Mexican War. But the Texans weren't done, as Sam Houston ordered for the Muir expedition to kick out the remaining Mexican soldiers from southern Texas. The expedition was successful, considering the fact that they found no evidence of Mexican soldiers in Texan lands. This would not do for the Rangers, who now planned to return home with no heroic story to tell. That wouldn't do. No. They needed a story. So they crossed the Rio Grande River and set off to fight the Mexican army. Overconfidence is the death of many military expeditions, and this one would be no different. A battle would ensue that would see the outnumbered Rangers fight bravely until they became hungry and thirsty from a day's worth of battling. The Texans decided to surrender. President Santa Anna then ordered for the execution of the Texans, but a compromise would be made, and only 1/10 of the Texan soldiers would be executed. This was decimation to the definition, and the 10th man in every group was picked by a black bean. The 176 Texans were blindfolded and presented with a jar full of supposedly black and white beans. White beans meant life, and black beans, well, that was death. 17 Texans drew black beans and were executed, many of them being high-ranking officers, suggesting foul play. The rest of the 159 soldiers were sent to a prison in Mexico City, most likely joining their Santa Fe expedition brethren. The ultimate goal of Sam Houston's second term would be for protection from Mexico by joining with the United States. Their current president was a man named John Tyler, who considered the Texas annexation as his administrative priority. In April of 1844, a few months before the end of Houston and Tyler's presidencies, an official annexation treaty would be signed. It looked like his mission of annexation was complete, until 4 months later in June, where the U.S. Congress rejected the prospect of annexation, due to Texas being a slave state. The life goal of Sam Houston was very nearly in grasp. Surely, Texas would become a state soon. A land-hungry candidate that wanted Texas to be annexed ran, and won the 1844 American presidential election. His name was James K. Polk. The 1844 Texan presidential election would also take place, and the successors of Houston wouldn't kill themselves this time, as the 4th president of Texas, Anson Jones, would move from his position of Secretary of State to president on December 9th of 1844. Houston would end his term with Texas being $12 million in debt, but this is a decrease from the rate of debt that had been incurred under Lamar. Anson Jones was born on January 20th, 1798, in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. He was the son of Solomon Jones and his wife, Sarah Strong. In his early life, Anson Jones hoped to become a printing master and a journalist for a newspaper. This passion for news would be quickly pushed to the side when Jones discovered that there was a much bigger paycheck to be had with the medical industry. So Anson attended medical school in Seneca Falls, New York, surely becoming the apprentice of a local doctor. It took only a few years for Jones to graduate and earn his medical degree. He was licensed to practice medicine by the Oneida New York Medical Society. Medical school left Jones with a few things: the title of doctor, and a boatload of debt that would soon start compounding. To start practicing medicine, Dr. Jones moved to Shenango County, New York in 1822, where he opened a new medical practice. He rented out an office, then began to receive a flood of clients. Well, that's what would have happened if Anson Jones got any business, which he did not get much of. The town that he lived in, Bainbridge, wasn't even really a town. It was considered a village. To this day, it's so small that it only has 1,350 residents, and had even less in 1822. So the doctor moved his medical practice further west to Norwich, New York, and rented out a new building. He also slightly changed careers, switching from a doctor to a pharmacist as he opened a drugstore. The debt was starting to snowball in the wrong direction, as his drugstore received very little business. It must be the location, is what he thought before once again moving, further west and a little south this time, to modern-day Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. There, he once again owned and operated a largely unsuccessful drugstore. The debt was starting to become a problem, but if Jones could just find the right location, then he could pay it off in no time. In early 1823, Dr. Jones decided to open his little drugstore in the big city of Philadelphia. Unfortunately for Jones, this is when the past would catch up with him. The doctor would be arrested by his creditor, but was subsequently released as he promised to pay off his debt by teaching medicine in Philadelphia. So that's exactly what he did, and he also ran a very small medical office as well. And for the first time in his life, Anson Jones' bank account went from red to green, which is why the next decision that he made is a perplexing one. In 1824, only about 2 years after coming to Philadelphia, he left. Location is key, and he had thought that he had found the lock, but was sorely disappointed as he opened another unsuccessful business venture. This time in the newly independent country of Grand Colombia. More specifically, he went to Venezuela. I'm sure he enjoyed the warm weather. This also would have been Anson's first experience with Latino culture. It is unknown what Jones did while in Venezuela, but we can assume that whatever he did, he lost money. In 1826, Jones returned to Philadelphia with new hopes in his eyes. He was a licensed doctor, but he never received an MD degree. He attended Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia and earned his MD by 1827. Despite being considered a failed doctor, Jones managed to develop quite a reputation. This can be seen as he was a Grand Master of a Masonic Lodge, an Independent Order of Oddfellows Lodge, and a Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, which is odd considering his finances and levels of success that he never achieved. Jones would finally give up on being a doctor in 1832 and would move from Philadelphia once again, this time going to the city of New Orleans. 1832 also happened to be the year that New Orleans would experience an outbreak of both cholera and yellow fever, which Anson would catch both of. After fighting off these two diseases, one after the other, he had enough of this new city. His friend, Jeremiah Brown, told Jones about the growing number of American settlers in Texas, so he decided to check it out for himself. He arrived in Texas for the first time in 1833, but was left pretty unimpressed by it. He was about to leave and go back to his disease-ridden New Orleans, but the citizens in the Texan town of Brazoria pleaded for him to stay. Wait, the people actually wanted Jones? Could it be? Did he finally find the right location? The answer would be yes, because after deciding on staying, he went back into medicine and opened up his medical practice again. This new location would gross the now successful doctor around $120,000 in modern estimates. Finally, he had found wealth and success in the medical industry. Then in 1834, he helped co-founding the first Masonic Lodge in Texas, which he would become the first Grand Master of. When the Texas Revolution broke out in 1835, Jones did not hesitate to enlist in the army of Sam Houston. He joined with the army as the rank of a private, although his role was to be one of the very few field surgeons that Texas had. It was probably after the Battle of San Jacinto that Anson Jones extensively spoke to the wounded Sam Houston. Houston, having shattered his ankle, was told by Jones to get better treatment in America. The Republic of Texas had begun, and Jones triumphantly returned to Brazoria, but a surprise waited for him there. In his doctor office was a man. More specifically, it was James Cullingworth. And in Anson's absence, he decided to convert his office into a law office. I don't know why, he just kinda took it while Jones was gone. Feeling insulted, and rightfully so, Jones threatened Cullingworth to a duel. Luckily, it would not escalate past this, and the duel never occurred. Later on, James Cullingworth would be the second of two men who killed themselves after being put on the presidential ballot during the second Texan election. In the first Texan government, Jones was appointed to be the chairman of Foreign Relations, which he staunchly opposed the American annexation of Texas. He was also the chairman on the Committee of Privileges and Elections. This role would see Jones try to regulate medical practice. In June of 1838, President Sam Houston appointed Jones as the minister to the U.S., but on one condition. From here on out, Jones would have to be pro-annexation. This, he wholeheartedly accepted. But only a year later, in 1839, Jones would be booted from his government seat by the new president, Maribel B. Lamar. Jones decided to retire from politics after this and continued to practice medicine in Brazoria, until one day, he was called to serve in the new government when a member of the Texan House of Representatives died. It was Jones who was selected to fill the role. In this, he was very vocally against President Lamar's economic and military policies. He was also elected as president pro tempore in 1840. After Lamar's presidency was over, Anson could finally return to Brazoria, but not so fast because he just got promoted to another government seat. After winning the 1841 election, President Sam Houston appointed Jones as his Secretary of State. This was a chance for the already decorated Anson Jones to become even more established in politics, so he accepted the role. Sam had a special mission for Jones, as he put him in control of foreign relations. Trying to gain recognition from European countries would increase the likelihood of U.S. annexation, but Jones worked on both things at the same time to achieve the ultimate goal of annexation. Through this plan is where Anson Jones would earn his most famous moniker, Eyebrows. Just kidding, his real nickname was the Architect of Annexation. He would work this strategy until it seemed like his work had paid off in 1844. U.S. President John Tyler just passed the annexation of Texas to be voted on in the U.S. Senate. There, it would be shot down, as all of Anson's hard work seemed to go down the drain. But there was still hope, seeing as a new U.S. presidential candidate would run on a platform focused towards the annexation of Texas, and James K. Polk would win that election in 1845. But a week before, he is set to take office, President Tyler puts the question of annexation back to Congress. This time, they accept. At this point, Anson Jones was already the fourth president of Texas, running on the same ideas and platform that his predecessor Sam Houston ran on. That should be it then. Texas should get annexed now. Except, it didn't. The other part of Jones's plans was to gain recognition from European countries, namely the country of Britain. Britain had told Jones to wait 90 days until Texas could vote on annexation, so they could finalize their own treaty with Mexico. So for 90 whole days, Jones sits there as president of Texas and does nothing at all. These 3 short months would ruin his whole political career. After the 90 days were up, Jones sent the question of Texas annexation to the Texas Congress. The Congress complied, and annexation was due to occur. They just needed to pick a date now. The 2 countries decided that the end of Anson's presidency would be the date. The date was February 19, 1846. For the remaining 2 years, Anson did nothing. He already achieved his campaign promise. Now it was just time to sit back and relax. The last official act of Jones, and any Texas president for that matter, was to lower the flag of the Republic of Texas, and in its place, raise the American flag in the Texan capital of Austin. His last words, as president, were, "The Republic of Texas is no more." And with that, Texas became part of America. As for Anson, he retired to the town of Barrington, Texas, where he became a successful farmer. Anson wanted to remain in Texas politics, but was largely shunned for his 90 days of do-nothingness. A few years later, in 1849, Jones would fall from his horse. This would leave him with a very immobile and crippled left arm. Then, in 1857, after the suicide of a Texan politician, Jones was convinced that he would get called to join the House of Representatives. But as he ran, he received 0 votes. With a ruined political career and a crippled arm, Anson Jones joined the many Texas politicians that committed suicide. He would shoot himself on January 9, 1858, just 11 days shy of his 60th birthday.